When Nicola STurgeon's government took over the running of Scotland's railways just last month, the First Minister promised that passenger services would be efficient, sustainable, fit for the future. But in just 7 weeks since the SNP took control, passengers have faced chaos and disruption. Every day, hundreds of services have been cancelled, often at the very last minute. First Minister, will you apologise to the thousands of passengers? Here we go, the SNP members say. Here we go. Well, yes, here we go. First Minister. First Minister, will you apologise to the thousands of passengers who have faced this disruption since the SNP took control of Scotland's railways?
Let me turn now to the important issue of rail services, and I do appreciate the opportunity to address this issue, which is of significant concern to rail passengers. And let me just say at the outset, I always express apologies to anybody, whether on our rail services or in any other public services, that are not getting the standard of service that they deserve. Scotrail has taken the decision to put in place a temporary timetable that has been made necessary by the decision of some drivers not to take up the option of overtime, Sunday and rest day working as part of a pay dispute. Scotrail considered that issue and, in consultation with Transport Focus, which is the organisation that represents passengers, decided that a temporary timetable was preferable to unplanned cancellations. However, let me stress this point, and let me make this point very strongly. It is vital to get the timetable back to normal as quickly as possible, and I expect Scotrail to review the temporary arrangements regularly. Indeed, it is due to be formally reviewed on the 3rd of June. And I think there are 2 points that are material in that regard. Firstly, it is important to seek to reach an agreement on pay, a fair agreement on pay as quickly as possible. Train drivers right now before overtime earn around £50,000 a year. Notwithstanding that, this is a tough time for everyone, so everybody wants to see a fair pay award, but of course all pay awards do require to be affordable. And secondly, Scotrail continues to reduce the need for rest day working through training new drivers. The training programme was interrupted by COVID, but a significant number of new drivers are currently going through training. So I expect Scotrail to make sure that this temporary timetable is just that, temporary, and the timetable gets back to normal as quickly as possible. And of course I will ask the Transport Minister to ensure that MSPs are kept fully up to date.
Douglas Ross. First Minister said twice that she appreciated the opportunity to update the Chamber on the Scotrail issue, but it seems she didn't appreciate the opportunity to say sorry. Those words did not come out of the First Minister's mouth. She mentioned about, well actually I did listen, and the First Minister said she will take opportunities to apologise, and then she didn't. And passengers deserve an apology, because it's not just the cuts they have seen up until now. From next week, there will be even more. 700 services lost every day. Almost a third will disappear. And on some lines, it gets even worse. Services from Glasgow to Dumfries are being halved. It's the same on the Edinburgh to Tweedbank line. Dunbar station goes from 11 Scotrail services every day to 0. None. Scotrail passengers will be left with a reduced timetable or no trains at all. Yesterday, the SNP's Transport Minister couldn't give passengers any guarantee about when these cancellations will end. And it's no wonder. Kevin Lindsay of the Train Drivers Union ASLEF said this on Monday of the Scottish Government's role in settling this dispute. This is a direct quote from the union. Quite frankly, it is the worst negotiations I've been part of in 30 years as a union representative. First Minister, with such terrible handling of the negotiations by your government, just when can passengers expect normal service to resume?
First Minister. Well, firstly, I think Douglas Ross decides what he wants to hear and what he doesn't want to hear often. I think the problem, though, for him is that other people are listening to my answers as well. So I started my answer by saying I always take the opportunity to apologise to any member of the public in Scotland who doesn't get from a public service, whether that is the railway or any other public service, the standard of service they have a right to expect. And that includes those who are being disrupted right now because of the temporary timetable being put in place by Scotrail. Secondly, the services that are affected, as I said, this is a temporary timetable. I would expect the timetable to return to normal as quickly as possible, and that expectation is being made very, very clear to Scotrail. And I've set out the requirements that we need to see progressed. Firstly, progress towards a fair but also affordable pay settlement for rail workers. But secondly, Scotrail continuing to progress the training of additional drivers so that reliance on rest day working can be reduced and, I hope, eventually eliminated. It is worth pointing out, of course, that we did last year negotiate and agree with ASLEF an extension to the rest day working arrangements. They are in place until October 2022. So it is disappointing to see them being affected in this way, but notwithstanding that, Scotrail is focusing on the steps that need to be taken. So I want to see services back to normal just as quickly as possible, and the Government will be doing everything we possibly can to bring about that outcome.
Douglas Ross.
Of course, these cuts are not just going to affect passengers, but they are devastating for businesses as well. Businesses in our city centres that are still reeling from the impact of the COVID pandemic are now facing another lost summer. In so many places across Scotland, people are not going to be able to get a train to use it after a night out. The Chief Operating Officer of Scotrail said yesterday, before the latest cuts were announced, that protecting the first and the last services was an absolute priority. That's a quote from the Chief Operating Officer. But that clearly has not happened. Take just one example. From Edinburgh to the Deputy First Minister's constituency in Perth. You won't have to leave an hour earlier, not 2 hours earlier, but more than 3 hours earlier. The last train from Edinburgh to Perth is now going to be at 8 o'clock instead of 18 minutes past 11 at night. And, Presiding Officer, that's just one example. On train services right across Scotland, the last train is being brought forward by hours. And this will have a profound impact on businesses, restaurants, bars and clubs. And this is a quote from the Nighttime Industries Association just this morning, who have called the cuts to these services, and I quote, another cruel blow. They go on to say that it will put at risk both Scotland's economic recovery and the future of many thousands of small businesses and jobs. First Minister, what compensation is your government going to provide to the businesses who are clearly going to be affected by these cuts?
First Minister.
Well, Presiding Officer, it is very clear, and I absolutely accept that these temporary cancellations, which are being made necessary by a pay dispute, are disruptive. They are disruptive to individuals and they are disruptive to businesses. That's why it is so important that I stress today, and that Scotrail works hard to ensure, that the temporary timetable is just that it is a temporary one, and that normal service is resumed as quickly as possible. And that is the focus of Scotrail, and the Government will do everything we can to support that outcome. It is also important to note that this temporary timetable, while of course it is regrettable that it is necessary, is designed to give more certainty to passengers for the short term, rather than have what we saw at the weekend, which was unplanned cancellations. So it is disruptive, it's not acceptable, it must get back to normal as quickly as possible. That is why we must see all parties get round the table and negotiate a fair and an affordable pay deal, but also that Scotrail must continue the work that it is already undertaking to train more drivers. There are already more drivers working for Scotrail than was the case in many previous years, but to train more drivers so that that reliance on rest day working is reduced and eventually eliminated. So that's the focus of Scotrail, that's the focus on government. But I would say to the unions as well, I understand their job to represent their members and to get a fair pay deal for members. But let's see both parties get round the table and negotiate that in good faith. I think that's what the travelling public would want to see as well.
Douglas Ross.
First Minister, you call this regrettable. Say that to the people in Dunbar who will have 0 trains operated by Scotrail stopping at their station. Say that to the business leaders who are telling you right now these cuts are going to put at risk thousands of jobs and small businesses. And let's remember, Nicola STurgeon and her government are in charge of Scotland's railways. Just last month, at Queen Street Station, the First Minister proclaimed that nationalising Scotrail was a new beginning, that it would deliver a railway for the nation. Yet passengers are now paying more than ever in fares and getting the worst service anyone has seen for a generation. 7 weeks into nationalisation, it's already proving a disaster. Just like the ferries, as soon as this government steps in to try and sort things out, problems get even worse. The SNP took over running of our rail service on April Fool's Day, but NatRail is no joke for Scotland's passengers. Next week, we'll see 700 fewer services across the country every day. Next week, 700 fewer services across the country every day. First Minister, was this really your grand vision for the railway in Scotland under SNP control?
First Minister.
I think public ownership of the railway is the right arrangement to have in place, and I do think it gives us the ability to ensure over the long term that we see real improvements in our railways. But make no bones about it, whether the railway was in public hands or still in private hands, Douglas Ross, rightly and properly, would be asking me these questions today, because these are matters of significant importance to people across the country. And of course it was to individuals and businesses that I was directing my comments in my earlier answer. On the issue of fares, of course, one of the benefits we do want to realise is affordable fares, but fares in Scotland, let's not forget, are already on average 20% cheaper than they are where Douglas Ross' party is in government. And on the issue of the temporary timetable, it is temporary. It has proven necessary because of the dispute. I want to see that dispute settled as soon as possible, and Scotrail continue to take the action to reduce reliance on rest day working. That's what it is right that Scotrail focuses on. It needs to see the unions back round the table negotiating on pay, and I hope that is the case as well. So we will continue to focus, yes, on these short-term challenges which are there and which are regrettable for those who use our railways. So we will focus on these short-term challenges, but we will also focus on building the longer-term improvements to our railway services that people across the country do want.